Today we are going to talk about animal welfare. We are going to talk about whether or not we have moral duties to animals, and if we do, what those moral duties are. To lay out the landscape here, I'm going to say, and this is maybe not exhaustive, we're going to talk today about three approaches to animal welfare, right? They are, and I have them written down right here, and we're going to go over all of them in a little bit of detail today, with some emphasis on the utilitarian view, of course, because technically the article for today was written by our old utilitarian friend, Peter Singer. So, before we get to his specific views, though, I want to lay out the general landscape. So, these are the three generally philosophical approaches to animal welfare. And we'll talk about them again in some more detail, but in the first place, there's the common view. This is sometimes called the indirect duty view. I call it the common view because it is the view that is held as common sense by most people. It represents the attitude that most rank and file people here in the United States and elsewhere have towards animals, right? Secondly, there is the inherent value view. As the name implies, this suggests that animals have a certain kind of inherent value and that it is wrong to use them in most ways, if not all ways. And finally, there is the utilitarian view. Hopefully you're familiar with that if you read the article for today. The utilitarian view, as utilitarians tend to do, they emphasize suffering, that using animals tends to lead to the animal suffering, and suffering for the utilitarian is inherently wrong, is inherently evil. Okay? So we are going to cover, say a little bit about each of these in what follows next. So we begin with the common view. And if you followed philosophy class this far, you should probably realize that anything that is called the common view or the common sense view is something that philosophers generally don't have a lot of respect for. So we are going to talk about the common view, and then we are immediately going to bash it and tell you what's wrong with your attitude towards animals. So the common view is this. This is also more technically known as the indirect duty view, right? So the common view says this, that abusing animals is wrong. It's wrong to hurt animals gratuitously. It's wrong to just, trap cats or dogs and then just, stick needles in them for the fun of it, right? In fact, truth be told, if you know anybody, especially a child who enjoys torturing animals this way, watch that kid, because this is a sign of a psychopath, right? True story. Psychopaths often start off at torturing animals as children. Anyway, but onto more pleasant subjects. So we generally agree that gratuitously hurting animals is wrong. That doesn't stop us, however, from, eating them, right? And in fact, it doesn't stop us from not feeling particularly bad about how they're treated at factory farms before they end up at a supermarket, right? So the common sense view tends to be that hurting animals gratuitously is wrong, but using them for food, using them for clothing, using them for labor, like on a farm or something like that, those things aren't wrong, right? Animals on this view are generally here to serve us, and we use them in a variety of ways and don't feel bad about it, right? Pardon me. Furthermore, a lot of people will point out that, animals are very, very useful in medical testing. Lots and lots of drugs and life-saving therapies have been developed because of the use and even suffering of lab rats and rabbits and so on in medical testing. And so if we were to reject this idea that animals exist for the benefit of humans and that we are not allowed to use animals, then hey, people might die, right? So on this view, on the common sense view, it's wrong to hurt animals gratuitously, but it's not wrong to the animal. A lot of people think, right? So if I torture an animal, I'm not necessarily doing anything wrong, and this is where things maybe get a little bizarre, but I haven't done anything wrong to the animal. What I've done instead, well, there are a few ways of describing how I might be doing something wrong, even if I'm not doing anything wrong to the animal, which is to say that I'm not violating the rights of the animal, right? It might be that I cause suffering. When I cause suffering in an animal, I am desensitizing myself to the suffering of another being, right? Our old friend Immanuel Kant thought that this is what was wrong with hurting animals. It wasn't that you were doing anything wrong to the animal. The animal has no rights, he said. But you're doing something wrong to yourself. You're hurting your soul because you are inuring yourself to the suffering of another being, right? So the important view on this, the important thing to understand on this common sense view is that animals have no rights, but maybe we shouldn't hurt them for certain reasons, right? The biggest, most important reason why we should not hurt animals, even if they don't have moral rights. The most important reason is because a lot of people have sentimental, emotional attachments to animals, right? If I kill your dog, that upsets you. You feel wronged, right? And so it's morally wrong to kill your dog, not because the dog had a right not to be killed, but because you have a right to not have your dog killed. It's basically like a property crime. Right, in the same way that if I take a baseball bat and bash the windshield of your car in, right, I have done damage to you. I've done damage to your property, right? It wouldn't make any sense to say that I've sinned against the car, right? And a lot of people view this, think of animals in the same way, and in fact, our laws tend to treat. This has changed a bit over the past few decades. But traditionally, laws have tended to treat animals as though they're just another kind of property. If I shoot your cow, I have damaged you, not because the cow had a right to live, but because the cow helped you run your farm, right? And now I have to pay restitution to help you replace the cow, right? Same thing with an animal, right? Or same thing with a family pet, with a dog, right? These laws have changed over the years, especially here in the United States, because it occurred to somebody decades ago that wait a second, if my mean neighbor shoots my family dog, and then just gives me $50 to buy a new dog, well, I'm not made whole because my family has been heartbroken over the loss of their beloved family pet. So now in the United States, there are different laws that cover damage to animals, right, and treat animals as something more than just property. Somewhat infamously, a lot of the laws about hurting animals are a lot more serious than, say, beating up your girlfriend, right? A lot of feminists have pointed out that if you assault a woman that you're in a relationship with, and this is a domestic issue, you might end up serving 2 years time served. But if you kill her dog, you can go to jail for 5 years, right? So partly some of the screwed up laws in our country. Anyway, but I digress. So On the common sense view of animals, human beings have duties to each other, but we don't have moral duties towards animals. And the reason why, even though this is a common sense view that not many people think about very much, but the reason why we have moral duties to fellow human beings but not to animals, typically the reason is given is that, well, human beings can respect my rights, right? And going back to the social contract theory that we talked about, speaking of animals, that we talked about in the second part of class, there is this tradition in Western political and moral philosophy that an important part of having rights means the ability to respect the rights of others, right? And here we get the most direct and coherent explanation of why animals don't have rights. Animals don't have the ability to respect rights, right? Otis, for instance, doesn't respect the right that my students have to get a lecture from me that is uninterrupted by a need for him to be rubbed between the ears, right? So he doesn't have the ability to respect my rights or your rights, but I have the ability to respect your rights, and so having rights requires a kind of reciprocation, right? Animals can't respect rights and so don't have rights. Now, I shouldn't hurt animals because people tend to have sentimental attachment to animals, and because it tends to inure us to the suffering of fellow human beings. But generally speaking, animals don't have rights. That's the common sense view, and that's what makes it okay to eat cows, to use horses for sport, to keep snakes as pets, and so on. That's right, people keep snakes as pets. My wife's afraid of snakes. Whoops. Okay. So animals can't respect rights, therefore have no moral rights, and hurting animals is wrong because of the emotional attachments people have to them. This is the common sense view. So get this, before we talk about the problems with this view, get this in your notes. This is the common view, also known as the indirect duty view. Abusing animals is wrong, but using them for... That's fine. Abusing animals is wrong, but using them for food, medicine, etc. is not. Humans have moral duties to each other, but not animals. Animals can't respect rights, therefore have no moral rights. Hurting animals is wrong because of the emotional attachment people have to them. Okay, so there's two problems with this view. And one of them is not such a big problem, and the other one is a knockout blow. And we'll show that this view is not does not stand up to any sort of philosophical rigor. In the first case, let's talk about hurting animals. According to this view, it is wrong to hurt animals because of the sentimental attachment that people have to animals. Does that mean that it's okay then to torture a stray dog? That still seems weird, right? Or that still seems icky. It still seems bad, right? Although now I'm having fantasies about hurting a cat. But anyway, no, I wouldn't hurt him. I might put him in the basement. Anyway, so the sort of strange result of this common sense view is that, well, now wait a second. What if there are some animals that people have no sentimental attachments to? You know, can we just breed rats and do absolutely whatever we want to them and not worry at all about hurting them or torturing them or whatever? Nobody cares about them, right? And that seems wrong. It seems like there's something missing from this reasoning, right? Now, here's the big problem. Here's the big problem with this idea that treating moral rights as sort of as reciprocal, right? Remember I said that animals, on this view, animals don't have rights because animals can't respect rights, and that a prerequisite of having rights means that you have the ability to respect the rights of others, right? This is a view often called contractarianism, right? And you can see that it's kind of part and parcel of the social contract theory, right? The major problem with this view is this. There are a variety of beings that have moral rights. We all agree they have moral rights and deserve moral consideration, even though they can't respect the rights of others, right? The first one that comes to mind is children, right? So imagine a child, a very young child, a 2-year-old. Let's say I'm walking through the park. I see a family with a 2-year-old. I think, it would be really fun. I'm going to punt that 2-year-old. And I run up to the 2-year-old and I kick it. And it's a good kick. It's a good punt. It flies up over the tree. And I say, hey, extra point, right? Now, the parents will be horrified, obviously. So will the police who arrive to arrest me. Now, answer me this. To whom have I sinned? Have I sinned against the parents? Well, yes. But also, doesn't it seem like I've sinned against the 2-year-old? I mean, as he flies through the air. It seems like I've done something wrong, not just to the parents who have an emotional attachment to the child, but also to the child himself, right? So this seems to subvert the idea that to have moral rights, you have to be able to respect moral rights. A 2-year-old can't respect the moral rights of others. They don't yet have those sorts of concepts, right? And in fact, there are a variety of animals that have the intellectual ability of 2 or 3-year-olds. A lot of the great apes, for instance, gorillas. Have about the mental capacity of a toddler, right? Of a human toddler, right? Now, it seems more wrong to hurt a human toddler than it does to hurt an adult gorilla, but it's not exactly easy to say why, according to this common sense view, right? So I belabor this because I want to point out that the common sense view that we often hold about animals, and hey, I'm not a vegetarian. I wear clothes made of animals. I'm a hypocrite when it comes to this kind of stuff too. But I want to point out that this common sense view that we hold doesn't really stand up to philosophical scrutiny. Okay. So, what are the other views that we might hold about animal welfare? So, glad you asked. Let's get into it. Next up is a different approach to animal welfare called that we'll call the inherent value view. This is a view about animal welfare that is derived from the teachings of Immanuel Kant, and a lot of modern Kantians adopt this view. Just as a historical footnote, Kant himself, as I've already pointed out, Kant thought that animals had no rights. Abusing them was wrong because it hurt your soul. But Kant was one of those people who thought that having moral rights required the ability to reciprocate moral rights, and so thought that animals were then disqualified from the moral realm, right? Furthermore, Kant adopted a even more conservative view about the relationship between animals and human beings, and thought that he adopted a straightforwardly biblical view of the relationship between animals and humans. That in the Bible it says that animals are here to be used by human beings, right? And so he saw animals as basically subjects of human beings, right? And he thought there was nothing wrong with using animals as mere means. Hopefully you're familiar with that terminology and you remember something about God, right? And in fact, the only way to use animals was to use them as mere means, because animals are not capable of consenting, right, to being used, right? So, okay, so modern Kantians have rejected Kant's views on animals, and have argued that we actually can expand Kant's moral theory to include animals, right? Now, the inherent value view looks at animals and says that, well, okay, well, what is it that's valuable about animals? Back up. What is it that is valuable about human beings, right? What is the ultimate sort of moral value of human beings? And the answer that people on this view give is that, well, we're valuable because we have a unique experience of life. Every one of us, we are having this little subjective experience of life. We have these little lives. We have hopes and fears and wishes and desires. And if you poke us, we hurt, right? And we all have this little narrative. We all have this little experience of life. And some people think that this is the ultimate value. This is ultimately what it is that makes human beings valuable in a way that this marker or this house doesn't have an experience of life. It doesn't have a subjective experience. And so inanimate objects don't show up on our moral calculations. They don't have moral rights. They don't deserve moral consideration because they are not the experiencing subjects of lives, right? Now, here's what comes next. Some things are the experiencing subjects of lives. Human beings, for instance, obviously, but also many animals seem to be the experiencing subjects of lives. They have consciousness. They have an awareness of their surrounding. They have things that they fear and things that they want. They may not fear or want things in exactly the same more cognitively sophisticated ways that human beings do, but there's no denying that they have these little internal worlds. They have these little experiences of life, right? So as such, if it is the experience of life that is the ultimate moral value, animals have this experience of life, and therefore animals deserve moral consideration. Pretty straightforward argument. In fact, they deserve the same kind of moral consideration that you and I deserve, right? So if it's the subjective experience that is the ultimate moral value for humans, why shouldn't it be just as valuable for animals? Why should we end this subjective experience of theirs? Why should we enslave this subjective experience of theirs? Why should we take an animal who might otherwise live in the wild and confine it to a small cage and pump it full of hormones to make it big and fat so that we can eat it, right? On this view, animals are not they are not our playthings. They are not objects to be used by us. And they are not objects to be used by us for exactly the same reason that you are not an object to be used by someone else. On this view, enslaving an animal, eating an animal, beating an animal, using an animal for food or clothing, conducting medical experiments on animals for the benefit of not the animal but for others, it's wrong, and it's wrong for all the same reasons as it's wrong to do to you, right? So, okay. Here is the inherent value of U. The inherent value of U says that animals are the experiencing subjects of lives. They have these little unique experiences of lives that are important to them in the same way, in a way that much similar to your experience of life is valuable to you. It is this subjective experience that is the ultimate moral value for humans. Why shouldn't it be just as valuable for animals? It is not ours to dispose of or to enslave. The use of animals on this view in any way is morally wrong. For exactly the same reasons, using you is wrong. This is a bit of a, we're philosophers. We like our extremist positions. The people who adopt the inherent value of you and philosophers who have adopted this view in the modern era are Tom Regan and Christine Korsgaard, who's a very prominent Kantian, neo-Kantian. They're a bit fanatic about the relationship between human and animals. They think that animals deserve all the kinds of considerations that we would give to human beings. I heard Christine Korsgaard on a philosophy podcast talking about this very issue. She wrote a book about this about this issue a few years ago, and she these people are against she's against owning pets, right? Taking an animal out of the wild to entertain you and keep around your house and make up little stories about how much they love you is nothing short of slavery, right? The interviewer asked her, well, what if I move into a house and I have an infestation of mice, right? What are my moral obligations to the mice in my house? It's not sanitary, and it's very embarrassing and gross to have mice all over your house, right? And Korsgaard said, well, there are a variety of ways to try to discourage mice from hanging out in your house. You can clean better, you can use no-kill traps, and so on, right? And one of the things I was dying for the interviewer to ask her was, well, I can't own a cat, right? But what if there are, what if I live on a farm and there are kind of stray farm cats, and I start encouraging cats to hang out at my house, right? To kill the mice, right? And this is an interesting question to me because philosophers on these issues, they're always very, very concerned with with human on animal violence. They never seem terribly concerned about animal on animal violence. And if I just encourage cats to do what comes naturally to them, namely slaughter whole families of mice, have I violated some sort of moral rule? Anyway, something to think about. Okay. Next, we get to, last but not least, the utilitarian view on animal welfare. Okay, so I saved utilitarianism for last because this is the article that we went to that we read for today is Peter Singer's article about whether or not animals are equal, right? Singer, in case you don't know, I have belabored this at some length, but in case this is not quite sunk in, Singer is a utilitarian. He is by far the most prominent and well-known utilitarian in the world today. And as a utilitarian, he thinks that the most important moral issue, in fact, the only moral issue, is suffering. If things can suffer, then they show up on the moral radar, right? And so his views on animal welfare should be pretty clear. Singer thinks that the question of our use of animals and our relationship with animals begins and ends with suffering, with their ability to suffer. That is the only moral issue in the question of the relationship between humans and animals. It is clear, absolutely evident to Singer that animals suffer, and therefore they deserve moral consideration, regardless of whether or not they have inherent value, regardless of whether or not they can reciprocate, they can respect the rights of other beings. None of this matters one little bit to Singer. The issue is suffering, right? And so they deserve moral consideration. Now let's pause for a moment to breeze by this, because it seems to Singer and frankly to me pretty obvious. But how do we know that animals suffer? Well, Singer's answer to this is, well, they act pretty much the way that you act whenever I hurt you, right? If I kick a dog, the dog behaves in much the same way that I behave if you kick me, right? I make a squealing noise and I yell and I run away, right? If you put a lobster in a pot of boiling water, the lobster behaves in much the same way that I would behave if you put me in a pot of boiling water, right? I would make a high-pitched squeal, and I would begin to bang on the side of the pot and try to get the lid off, right? So from Singer's perspective, and the perspective of the other utilitarians on this subject, well, if you're going to deny that lobsters experience pain, you're going to deny that dogs experience pain, then you got to have the same kind of skepticism when it comes to human beings, right? Yes, when you whip me, I am in pain, but when you whip those other people, they don't really experience pain in the same way, right? Now, I have not chosen that particular example entirely at random. The truth is, the very, very ugly truth is, that throughout the history of slavery in the United States, it was a very, very commonly held view that people of African descent did not experience pain in the same way that human beings did. That they had that white human beings did. They had a very high pain tolerance. So when you whipped a slave, it wasn't like whipping. It's not as bad as whipping a white person, right? Yes, same thing with women, right? Women having babies, right? Commonly held that women have a higher tolerance of pain, particularly when it comes to childbirth, right? And so the screams and the agony that they go through isn't quite like isn't quite what it would be like if a man went through that. I mean, if a man had some small being tearing its way out of its private parts, I mean, that would be unbelievable, right? The human race would die out. But with women, that's just nature, right? And in fact, not for nothing, whenever it became whenever there became various drugs available to lessen the pain of childbirth, epidurals and painkillers and so on, it was controversial because, well, childbirth's just natural, and we don't want to lessen the pain of childbirth. I mean, it isn't that bad, right? Anyway, so I bring these up because they constitute a kind of centerpiece of Singer's thoughts on animal welfare. Singer looks back on the really, really ugly, unsavory history of diminishing the pain and of certain populations and certain kinds of people, and using the diminishment of that pain and the diminishment of the experiences of those people, the diminishment of the intelligence of those people. And he sees a parallel between how we treat animals, right? In fact, he is famous for popularizing the word speciesism, right? Speciesism is meant to invoke, it's meant to be a reference to sexism and to racism. And speciesism is Singer's word. He didn't coin the word, but he popularized it. It's Singer's word for the assumption, the fallacious assumption, he thinks, the wrong assumption, that humans are superior to animals in a way that justifies using them as food, clothing, labor, etc. And Singer draws parallels to minorities and women who have been exploited for reasons related to their alleged inherent inferiority, right? This has proved very controversial. I mean, Singer has never backed away from controversy. Feminists are not crazy about this argument. Neither are people who write about racism. I mean, he's comparing women, and he seems to be comparing women and minorities to animals. Some people take umbrage to that. Singer, on the other hand, thinks, no, you're looking at it the wrong way. The truth is, we should view the way that we treat animals with the same sort of attitude that we used to treat women and minorities. We should view it with the same sort of gimlet eye, the same sort of skewed view, right? Here are the notes. There will be more notes, but here are the notes to write down on the utilitarian view. First of all, we begin with speciesism. Speciesism is the assumption that humans are superior to animals in a way that justifies using them as food, clothing, labor, etc. Singer draws parallels to sexism and racism. Women and minorities have been exploited for reasons related to their quote-unquote inherent inferiority. And I didn't close parentheses there. So there you go. Close parentheses are at the bottom. So what are the implications of this? Good question. So, again, Singer thinks that the only moral issue here is suffering. Animals suffer and so should not be used in any way that injures them. They should not be used for food, for labor, for clothing, for pets, or in zoos, or for medical research, right? Now, a few of these need to be, we need to elaborate a little bit on this. First of all, for food, Singer admits that there may be some cases, some parts of the world, for instance, where the only food available is going to be some sort of protein, some sort of animal. And if it comes down to that, then we might be justified in eating animals, right? But he argues at considerable length that not only are we capable of a vegetarian diet, but vegetarian diets are considerably more healthy than meat-based diets, right? We should not use animals for labor. Any labor that can be done can be used by technology. We shouldn't be using horses to pull plows. We shouldn't be using cows or cattle. We shouldn't be using horses for horse racing. Anything that involves disrupting the natural course of an animal's life, Singer thinks is inherently wrong, right? Their lives are not ours, do not belong to us to dispose of, right? Obviously, we should not use animals for clothing. Leather and other kinds of clothing based on animal made from animals is extraneous. It's useless. It's worn just for a kind of status symbol, right? This includes wool from sheep, right? It's not necessarily hurting the sheep by shearing it, right? So you would think that would be relatively harmless, but that requires keeping the sheep as a slave on your little farm, right? And he's against that, right? Furthermore, animals used for pets or zoos, right? Zoos, it should be clear, is nothing but keeping animals as slaves, keeping animals in prison, right? Tigers are not born to roam the St. Louis Zoo. They are built to roam out in the jungle, right? They should their lives again are not ours to dispose of, right? Now, the facts on the ground for both pets and for zoos is that there has been a long and onerous tradition in this country of people owning pets and being irresponsible with their pets. So, we're talking about animals who are bred to be in a petting zoo, right? You can't just return those animals to the wild. Understood. Those poor animals are going to have to live their lives as best they can in some sort of unnatural setting. So we just have to make the best that we can do with that, right? But from Singer's perspective, those should be the only kinds of animals, and I think that mostly they are these days. Those should be the only kinds of animals that we see at zoos, right? Are people who have gotten ostriches through some sort of ill-gotten way, and there's no way to release them into the wild, so the zoo is the best possible option. But hopefully someday zoos will be out of business, right? Same thing with pets. This is where things get a little controversial. For me personally, I have 3 cats. I'm not giving up my pets. I don't care what some philosopher says. But ideally, basically all the philosophers on all sides of this issue that we've talked about now, think that ideally pets, we would not own pets. Pets are more pets. The phenomenon of pets turns out to be more trouble than it's worth. People tend to breed pets, it's hard to find them homes. They end up as strays and so on and so forth. So it would be ideal eventually if we had no pets, right? Now, if I may editorialize for a second, from a utilitarian perspective, if all that matters is suffering and pleasure, I think the cats in my house have lived a life of a great deal of pleasure and a bare minimum of pain, right? Certainly they live better lives than stray cats. So Singer, Schminger. Anyway, the most controversial position for any of the philosophers on the issue of animal rights, by far the most controversial position they take is that they all oppose the use of animals in medical research, right? Now, this is really where the rubber hits the road, because if you talk to people who work in the medical profession, they, medical researchers will often tell you that the data that they compile from the use of rats and other kinds of animals in medical testing is invaluable, right? They all sorts of gene therapies, all sorts of medicines have been used on all kinds of animals, and yes, some of these experiments are bad. they're painful to the animals, right? But the argument goes that, well, if the painful, sad life of a rat results in medicine that's going to save the lives of human children, then you would have to be pretty crazy, Peter Singer, Tom Regan, Christine Korsgaard, to say that the life of that rat is not worth the lives of those children, right? So Singer's response to this, never one to back away from controversy. Singer's reply to this argument goes this way. He says, well, now wait a second. First of all, we tend to really exaggerate the role of animals in medical testing. We tend to lump together, when we talk about animals in medical testing, we tend to lump a lot of different sorts of experiments. Everything from testing perfumes on rabbits, by spraying them in the eyes with a perfume to see if it causes permanent damage. Because if it does, well, then we need to go back to the drawing board, because we can't sell this to humans, right? Which seems like a really frivolous thing to do to torture pretty frivolous reason to torture a rabbit, right? But that kind of stuff also gets grouped in with real effective gene therapies that can help to cure diseases, right? Well, Singer's reply to this is to say, well, now wait a second. If you're so convinced that this gene therapy, that this medical testing is going to result in some sort of life-changing gene therapy that is going to save the lives of, thousands, maybe millions of children, why not test on infants, human infants? I mean, if the sacrifice, is worth it, right? If the sacrifice of one life is going to save millions, why not sacrifice a human life, right? Of course, that makes us run up a tree, right? That freaks us out. That's when we say, oh my God, you've gone crazy. Well, that's Singer's point is, you see, you're not treating life as though, and suffering as equal. You're assuming that the suffering of this rat that's going to die is not as valuable and not as important as the suffering that that a human infant might endure, right? And he thinks, well, that's a double standard. If you're really so convinced that this medical test is so important, why not do it on a person? So Singer's a fanatic. Anyway, but maybe he has a point. Anyway, okay, so that wraps up my yes, good point. So that wraps up thank you, my lecture on animal welfare, and Peter Singer's views on that. What we are going to talk about next time is we are going to talk about a response to Steinbach's response to Peter Singer. She's going to respond pretty much point by point. And the attendance password for today is let's see. How about let's see? I can't think of one. So let's see is the password for today. So, okay. I will talk to you guys later. Thanks a lot, everybody.